So we're following the very latest out of Syria, where rebel forces have captured Damascus, toppling the regime of President Bashar al-Assad and forcing him to flee to Russia. NBC News White House correspondent Ali Rafa has more on the Biden administration's response.
At long last, the Assad regime has fallen.
President Biden reacting to the fall of the Assad regime and quick military action in Syria.
Just today, U.S. forces conducted a dozen of precision strikes.
Those strikes hitting more than 75 ISIS targets, including camps, leaders, and operatives. The White House hoping to prevent a resurgence by the terror group in the region.
We're clear-eyed about the fact that ISIS will try to take advantage of any vacuum. We will not let that happen.
The president committing to protecting the roughly 900 U.S. troops he says will remain in the country, while offering a blueprint of future U.S. support.
I'll send senior officials from my administration to the region as well to establish a transition away from the Assad regime.
Despite this, the president expressing cautious optimism after the rebel takeover of Syria.
It's a moment of historic opportunity.
While making clear the country's future is still uncertain, acknowledging the connection between the rebels and terrorist groups.
Make no mistake, some of the rebel groups that took down Assad have their own grim record of terrorism and human rights abuses.
Mr. Biden also committing to securing the release of Austin Tice, an American journalist and Marine veteran kidnapped in Syria more than a decade ago.
We believe he's alive. We think we can get him back. We have to identify where he is.
Tice's family, who had criticized the Biden administration for not doing more, hopeful fall of the Assad regime creates an opportunity to bring Austin home.
We are hopefully and prayerfully and joyfully waiting to get the news that Austin is walking free today.
All right, let's bring in Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker, former chief of staff at the CIA and Department of Defense, Jeremy Bash, staff writer at The Atlantic, David Frum joins us, and host of the show Amen on MSNBC, Ayman Mohyeldin. Good to have you all on board this morning.
Peter, let's start with you. What is the White House saying this morning, and what are they planning to do to influence these tumultuous movement in Syria and across the Middle East right now?
Well, this is a tricky situation, I think, for President Biden and the administration. Obviously, lots of celebration that Assad is gone. His family ruled with an iron fist for half a century. Nobody is shedding any tears for him today. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who come after him are going to be Jeffersonian Democrats. In fact, the main rebel group here was once an affiliate of al-Qaeda, is still on the State Department terrorist list. So the trick for the administration is deciding how do you engage with a group that you consider to be terrorists, and if so, how, what's the best way to do it? Now, the administration has been sending messages back and forth now to the Syrian rebel groups in recent days, using the Turks as intermediaries. The main thrust of those messages has been, as you take over, do not involve ISIS. Do not bring the Islamic State into your coalition. And they've been reassured by messages back saying, no, we're not going to do that. That's the main concern of the American policymakers at this point, not to allow ISIS to regain some traction in the vacuum that's following the deposing of Assad. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these new rebel groups are, going to be America's friends or going to be able to assert, real control over the country and create a better society. That's certainly the hope. Biden, you heard him say in that speech yesterday at the White House that they're willing to at least have an open mind about it. But the, U.S. policymakers are trying to figure out who are these guys taking over and can we work with them?
And Ayman, you've reported from Syria and the region for a very long time. I was comparing this to the shock that so many of us felt back in 1989, when you were too young, of course, but I can remember it, when one Warsaw Pact state after another just collapsed. And, a day at a time. We started reading these stories about a week ago, and no one could have imagined that a bloody 14-year civil war that cost 500,000 lives would be over in a matter of a week. But it was. Why?
That's a great question. And I think the people that I've been speaking to say that all of the major players in the region who backed these rebels, and including some in the United States, keep in mind this coalition of rebels, and we are focusing on mostly those that are, as they are known, HTS, that are the more hardline ones. There are others that the U.S. backs from the southwest part of the country, and those rebels are also in touch with HTS. They had a battlefield assessment. They looked at the map of the region. They saw that Iran, which is the major backer of the Syrian government, as well as Hezbollah, who is providing the foot soldiers on the ground to keep the Assad regime in power over the past several years. Both of those had been extremely diminished and weakened over the past 14 months because of the war in Gaza and because of the war in Lebanon with Israel. And as a result of Russia being embroiled in its war for the past 3 years in Ukraine, doesn't have the manpower, the resources to commit to keeping Assad in power. They assessed that situation on the behalf of the Syrian battlefield and said this is an opportune time for us to try and make our advance. They saw that the morale among the Syrian army is weak. The Syrian regime does not have any legitimacy among the people. They knew the soldiers would not be able to fight. They don't have cohesive command and control structures, and they don't have the resources to stay engaged in a battle against these rebels that are highly motivated, ideological, trained and disciplined, and as we've seen, well equipped over the past several years of this stalemate. So they seized the opportunity, and they were proven right.
David, all the pieces of the chessboard have been thrown in the air, not only over the past week, but also over the past 3-4 months. If you see the collapse of Hezbollah, Hamas on the run, you see Iran's air defenses completely shot. I mean, they are basically without air defense right now. What does this? What dangers and what opportunities does this massive power vacuum provide for the United States and other countries that are interested in stability in the region?
Well, just as you said, let's put this in a U.S. political context. President-elect Trump has said Syria is not our business. His vice president, J.D. Vance, has been repeating Russian propaganda about how Assad was the defender of religious minorities in Syria. What did the Syrian war do to the rest of the world? Since the war began, and especially since Russia intervened in 2015, half the population of Syria have been turned into refugees. Most of those people are living in Turkey, but millions of them fled to Europe after 2015, destabilizing every government in Europe, causing the rise of the European far right, a powerful force in driving Britain out of the European Union, a powerful force in electing Donald Trump in 2016. Now, as everyone on the panel said, putting together something stable in Syria, something decent, is going to be very, very hard. The idea that you could do it when the United States is about to go AWOL from the world is inconceivable. This aftermath is going to prove the indispensability of American leadership. And we're about to have an administration that doesn't believe that America can lead, or doesn't believe that America can cooperate. The United States should bark orders and everybody should listen. But to put together, to get people, this country in any way, to have any hope of doing that, to get refugees moving back home, the millions that are in Turkey, the hundreds of thousands in Europe, it's a big, big project. America is indispensable, and American cooperation with allies is indispensable, and we're about to have an administration that doesn't believe in any of that.
America is indispensable. Well, it is the indispensable power in the world.
Horrifying.
And if you don't believe us, just talk to our allies. They'll say the same thing. And Jonathan O'Meara, what this brings into sharper relief, are actually the selections of Pete Hegseth, a 40-something-year-old who's ill-equipped to be Secretary of Defense, has no experience that would allow him to be an effective Secretary of Defense for the incoming administration, and Tulsi Gabbard, who has a bizarre relationship, has had a bizarre relationship with Assad, and as far as often repeating talking points. But to have the head of your intel division, to have the Secretary of Defense, two people that are ill-equipped at one of the most fraught times in this region, I've got to believe, well, actually, I know, based on discussions this weekend, there are a lot of Republican senators that are just shaking their head quietly going, these nominees are not going to make it.
Yeah, Tulsi Gabbard had been sort of flying below the radar in recent weeks because of the controversy surrounding Matt Gaetz and then Pete Hegseth. What has happened this weekend in Syria has changed all that because of exactly what you just said, Joe. Her strange ties with al-Assad, the fact that she's at times voiced talking points from Moscow, of course, Putin being Assad's benefactor. So, Jeremy Bash, you obviously have great experience working at the Pentagon, working in these extremely sensitive levels of this nation's national security operations. Let's get your assessment here. What this means for this incoming Trump administration, as David said, who does not seem all that interested, perhaps, in being particularly internationalist. What would it mean if, indeed, Hegseth and Gabbard were confirmed to these posts?
Well, Jonathan, look, I think the good news here is that Iran has lost a proxy. I think Russia has lost a proxy. Hezbollah has been decimated, as noted. And so in some ways, you see some very positive developments in the region. Of course, for the people of Syria, this is a welcome day after a 14-year bloody civil war and a half-century of terrible rule by the Assad family. But, and this is critical, the U.S. continues to have interests in Syria. And primarily, we want to prevent it from becoming an ungoverned space, a terrorist safe haven. And for that reason, the United States is going to have to continue aggressive counterterrorism operations, including with some limited footprint on the ground, as we have in northeastern Syria, and including with a standoff airstrike capability for over-the-horizon counterterrorism operations. And if we don't do that, and if we don't work with Israel and Jordan and our Gulf Arab partners to shape the outcome of Syria, it's going to come for us. It's going to come for us in the form of refugees. It's going to come for us in the form of a safe haven for terrorist organizations. And so the incoming Trump team cannot be passive. It can't say, oh, let's not get involved. That's not a thing. That's not a thing that the United States can or should do. We have to get involved smartly, carefully. We're not going to be putting massive amounts of troops on the ground. We're not going to try to engage in nation building, but we have to try to shape the outcome. We have to stay on our front foot with respect to counterterrorism operations.